Hey everybody, welcome to another group leader training video. Today we're going to talk about what it means and looks like to lead a group gathering. So we've talked about what it means to be a group leader. We've talked about some of the dynamics of play when you're leading people, but today we're going to talk about probably the most practical thing, what gatherings look like. How do you actually lead one of those things week in and week out? So before we even begin, I want to just ask you guys to pause and reflect on when you leave a gathering, a group gathering on any given week, what runs through your head? What are you thinking about to help determine whether that was a good gathering or a bad gathering? So that's what I want you to kick around. What makes a gathering good? And what makes a gathering bad, or what could get in the way of that? Take a minute, pause the video, and jot down just some thoughts and reflections there. Cool, so I'm assuming you guys did that. Gosh, in this conversation, this video, a lot of the threads that we've talked about come together. Talking about creating a culture of discipleship, talking about what we're devoted to as a church, talking about what we depend on in the Word and the Spirit in the church. All of those things kind of come together in the group gathering. And that really is because when we do those things, they don't happen in a vacuum. They happen through the conduit of relationships. We get to challenge each other and encourage each other. We get to be devoted to things together and all that through the context of relationships. And those relationships happen when we get together and gather together as God's people. And so your group gatherings, your weekly group gatherings, that's really the primary context, the regular rhythmic context for this culture of discipleship that you're trying to create, right? And so that's a big deal. That's really important. We talked about how community groups are really smaller expressions of the local church. And so that means they are multifaceted. There are lots of components to it. And so we talked about how when we spend time together in our gatherings, we want to create three kinds of spaces for our groups when we get together. We want to create spaces to be under the Word together as disciples, to be around the table together as family, and to be among neighbors together as missionaries. And those three spaces align with the things that we want to do and we want to be as disciples. We want to learn from Jesus. We want to follow Jesus. We want to lead other people to Jesus. We want to be devoted to the Word. We want to be devoted to each other and to God. And we also, by the fruit of that, want to also see people added to God's church. And so we want to be around the table, under the Word, and among neighbors together. Now, we have to balance that, and so balancing that doesn't mean trying to carve out equal time for all three of those things every single week. Chances are that ain't going to happen, and if you do that, you're probably not going to be able to do any of them as well as you would like. And so we kind of spread that out a little bit and just encourage you guys to focus maybe on one of those kinds of gatherings in any given week, and if the other ones kind of spill over and there's some overlap, great. But really we want to kind of hone in on maybe one on any given week. And the balance that we encourage you guys to take, and this isn't a law, but it's just one of those things to kind of help check to see how you're doing if you are in balance, is on average maybe at least 2 times a month gathering together to be under the Word as disciples for that intentional discipleship conversation, to be around the table once a month as a family, just to get to know each other and invest in relationships, and once a month among neighbors, just to be present among the people that aren't part of the church, so that you can be on mission together, praying for other people and inviting other people, leading people to Jesus. So that's kind of the balance that we would encourage, but we know that might be different, and those balances might be heavier one way or the other based on where your group is and who your people are and the opportunities that God seems to bring before you, all of that stuff. But that's just kind of like a default plumb line for you guys to kind of check yourselves on and check your groups on or whatever. So all that to say, I want to dig into what each of those gatherings can look like, but first I really want to talk about a few things that are sort of true in general for most gatherings. So for you as a group leader, number one, every gathering has to be purposeful, right? You can't show up to a Wednesday night or Thursday night, whenever your group meets, and not have a plan, not have a purpose for why you're getting together on any given evening, right? You have to know why you're getting together. You're asking folks to give up their time to be there week in and week out. You better know why they're doing that, right? And have a purpose for that particular evening. That's just a really important thing to do. So, number one, have a purpose for your gatherings. Number two, and this will help kind of flesh that out a little bit, Your gathering is not just about the time that you spend together that night. Your gathering is not just about your gathering. It's about what you stir them up to do when they leave. And so here's the second time I want you to pause in this video. I want you to go look up Hebrews 10, 24 through 25. Read those couple of verses, and then come back to the video. All right, so assuming you've done that, what we hear the author of Hebrews talk about is that we get to come together, not neglecting to gather, but come together to encourage each other, but also to stir each other up to love and to do good works, right? And so our gatherings are, yes, about the time that we spend together, but they're also about what we're going to do when we leave, how we are living scattered out in our neighborhoods and the places that we live and work and play. And we say that every single week here on Sunday mornings. We say that we gather together to be built up as disciples so we can scatter back out as more faithful and effective servants and missionaries of Jesus. So we gather together so that we can scatter back out more faithfully and more effectively. So why are you gathering, right? Again, you have to have that purpose question. But maybe that's shaped by what do you want to send people out with, right? What are you sending them away with? What are you sending them challenged by? What are you sending them encouraged by? What life are you trying to give them on any given night that would allow them to be sent out in maybe a new and refreshed way back into their homes, back into their neighborhoods, back into their workplaces, back into their schools, wherever they happen to be. And this stems from just a full understanding of what discipleship is, right? It's not just information, it is transformation. That is the heart of discipleship. Yes, we have to learn, we have to know, but that information, that knowledge should shape us and change the way that we live. And so, in every gathering, I would encourage you to try to answer three things. Number one, and this correlates to learning, following, and leading. Number one, what should we be believing? Number two, how should we be living? And number three, how does God empower us to believe those things or to live in such a way? Those are three really basic questions. What are we supposed to be believing? How are we supposed to be living? And how are we empowered by God through the gospel and the Holy Spirit to be believing and living in such a way, right? Three basic questions. If you can answer those, and those might look different, the way that you go about answering those questions might look different based on the kind of gathering that you have. If you're under the word, then your focal passage, some of that stuff might be super explicit, answering those questions. Some of it may not be, but you get to fill in those blanks and figure that out for your own particular group. If you've got that stuff, if you know what those three things are, then you're on a good track to being able to declare what the purpose of your gathering for that night is, and to be able to send your people out with something at the end of your time together. The last thing is just to acknowledge for you guys to be mindful of what is unique about gathering together, right? So you could study the Bible on your own, you could pray on your own, you could eat a meal by yourself, you can sing by yourself, you could serve people by yourself, you can do all sorts of things on your own. What are the things that you can't do by yourself that you can only do when you're gathered together with God's people, right? You can sing together, that corporate worship and corporate meal and all that stuff. Why is that unique? What are the unique things that you get to do when you're gathered? And why does that matter? And allowing that to kind of shape what it is that you do with your time, right? At the end of the day, dude, we get to dialogue with each other in a way that we don't get to when we're apart. We get to use our gifts for each other for the building up of the church. We get to, again, pray together and sing together. We get to confess to other people and allow other folks in. We get to be vulnerable with people when we are together. We get to serve each other. There is, in general, just this experiential nature. There's this opportunity to actually practice what it is that God is telling us to do or how He's calling us to live when we are gathered together in a way that we just don't necessarily have when we are by ourselves. So take advantage of that. Make those opportunities, those gatherings, unique in those ways. Don't let folks leave at the end of the night and say, I just could have done that at home, right? I could have thought about that stuff or watched that video, or I could have listened to this thing, or I could have read that, right? Like, make it something where when they come, Every single week, it's something that they get to do and uniquely do when they are gathered together. Not everything you do is going to be super special and unique, but that's just something to be mindful of when you're trying to figure out what to do week in and week out. So hopefully that's helpful. So just to recap those three things: know the purpose of your gathering, send them out with something, know what those things are, and then make it a communal experience. Take advantage of being gathered together as God's people. So specifically to look at what it looks like to be under the Word, gathering together to be under the Word as disciples. Stereotypically, that looks like a discussion about the focal passage from the previous Sunday, and that's generally what we would encourage you guys to do. You don't have to do that. You could read a different book or whatever together if you want, but we strongly encourage that to be the default, just because we pick sermon series and books of the Bible that we go through together on purpose, because we want our church to grow in a particular way, and so we want our church to grow together in that at the same time. So if you're doing that also with most of the other community groups in the village. You are building off of what folks heard on Sunday, and so there's just a lot of synergy that comes about by being able to do that. So stereotypically, that's kind of what it looks like, digging into the focal passage and having some kind of discussion time together around that. Now, we don't have discussion guides. We don't provide you with questions to ask. We do every single week post a discipleship guide, which is not a discussion guide. It's not meant to be used for leading a community group. It's meant just to help you and everybody in the church ask some really basic questions about the focal passage, to make some observations, and there are a lot more to be made and a lot more conclusions to be drawn and all sorts of things than what is in that discipleship guide, but it's a place to start. And so that's out there for you and for the whole church to use. From that, or on your own, you can figure out what it looks like for you to lead your time together. And here's where there's kind of, there are two ditches that come into play. Most people, when they are leading, are either going to default to having a super scripted list of questions they want to ask that go from A to B to C to D to E to F, and so on. And then there's the other ditch, which is just show up and say, hey, what do you think this means? Or what does this mean to you? Or having a super open-ended time of conversation and really have no goal of getting anywhere. And both of those can be really problematic, because you could have on one side a really invitational, dynamic, interactive conversation, even though there's no structure to it. But it can be super dynamic and still not go anywhere. And folks leave at the end of the night and was like, well, we got to say some things that we thought, but we didn't actually land anywhere. I wasn't fed, I wasn't encouraged or challenged or anything like that at all. I wasn't involved, but what was the point of that? On the flip side, you can have a super scripted, purposeful line of questioning, but it really kind of shuts out people feeling like they're invited in, because they just get the impression week after week that you're looking for the right answer so you can go on to the next question. And so it really becomes more about how you see the text and you see the scripture and where you want to go with it. And if there's any interruption there, it can just kind of throw a wrench in the progression that you're hoping to have. And so what I want you to think about when it comes to leading those kinds of conversations is to think about having anchors, and really those three questions about: what is this text calling me to believe? What's this text, how is it calling me to live? And how does God empower me through the gospel by the Spirit to believe such a thing and to live in such a way? If you can answer those three questions and have just a couple of major points underneath each of those things, you can think of some questions to help stir up conversation around each of those things. And as you're doing that, as you're having that conversation, if someone jumps over here to talk about something else, chances are you don't have to freak out. It doesn't break any line of questioning, but you also have some thoughts around what that might be or what the text might be calling us to in this other realm where someone else might want to go. So it provides a way of being a little bit more free in the conversation, while at the same time having some real clear points that you want to drive home and send your folks out with at the end of the day. So call them anchors. You can call them whatever you want to, but I think that's a helpful way of approaching any given night, any given conversation. So being under the Word doesn't mean that it's a Bible study, right? Doesn't mean that the Bible is it for that night. Just because we say we're under the Word doesn't mean that you're only under the Word the whole time. You can actually do what the Bible might be telling you to do, or express what it's telling you to believe, whether that's praying together, whether that is singing together, maybe just even having some quiet time of reflection. I mean, I know it sounds almost like opposite of taking advantage of people being together to have them sit quietly and answer questions or whatever. But sometimes people's weeks are busy, and so carving out 10 minutes at the beginning or end or middle of a gathering to have folks think about something and then come back into the conversation or come back in prayer, that can be a really powerful time. So there are lots of ways that you can make your gatherings different. Even though it's under the Word, it's driven by the Word, it does not always have to be simply like digging and talking only about the Bible and that's it. You can introduce other things to help people apply and experience the Scriptures in a new way. So that's what under the Word time can look like. When it comes to being around the table, the focus on those nights really is just on relationships with people in your group. So again, getting to know folks, especially those who might be quiet. You might be really surprised at personalities and how they might come alive or not come alive in those times where it's just hanging out. There are some people that only want to talk about the Word. And there are some people who are more inclined to talk about life and to become the life of the party when there is just food at the table and you get to talk and just be together. So you get to see different sides of personalities, and really you just get to know each other better. So as you're tilling those soils of relationships, which really, again, like that is the conduit through which we get to build this culture of discipleship, you get to know those people better. You get to maybe have some deeper conversations and have some more intimate conversations with folks that maybe you wouldn't have during some other times. But all of that being said, you get to know your folks in a way, maybe during those times that when it does come time to being under the Word, or maybe there's a situation where you're counseling somebody, or maybe you are just meeting up with somebody one-on-one, you have this this breadth of knowledge about them. You have this really a more established friendship with them because of those times together that really give you a good grounding for trust and being able to speak into their life and knowing where they are and listening to them and them listening to you and all of those things. So those times can be really special and really important for you just to build relationships and be brothers and sisters together as God's family, because that is a facet of the church. And the last kind of gathering that we have is being among neighbors, and this can look a bunch of different ways. Really, it really is about relationships too. It's about being the church for people that aren't currently part of the church, putting a gospel community on display, either by just being out among neighbors where they are. Maybe it's serving in some way, or maybe it's doing something to invite other neighbors in. And you might have, in your future group, you might have like a lot of shared neighbors. Maybe a lot of the folks in your group know a lot of the same people that aren't in the church, and so there can be some shared mission there around reaching those people. Or maybe they're entirely different folks. Maybe your group is made up of people that don't even live near each other. You know, you're not going to run into each other at the grocery store or whatever. That's fine. You guys still get to figure out what mission looks like and how do you create spaces for the people that are in your life to invite them into gospel community, or for you guys as a group to love and to serve somebody else's neighbor. And you may not know someone else's neighbor, and your neighbor isn't more important than somebody else's neighbor. So when it comes time to figure out what that looks like, you don't have to fight about it. The goal and the hope is that the neighbor that you don't know, the neighbor of the person in your group that you're not familiar with yet, gosh, our hope is that that person would become your neighbor, at least in friendship and relationship, right? If that's who you're going to go after. So creating those spaces is important for mission. It gives you guys an outlet to express and practice a side of the church that otherwise you might not. It gives you guys something to pray for. Mission, man, drives sometimes hunger and thirst for the Word and for prayer and for God to move. And so it can really be a driver in mission and a bringing together of community around wanting to see God move in a powerful way. And so it can be a really cool thing to carve out that time together. So all that being said, those are some thoughts around gatherings. There are some logistical things in terms of hosting. What do you do with kids? Encourage you guys to involve kids as much as you can in your groups. That varies by age and maturity and all sorts of things, and we can talk about those logistics at some point in time. But you want to be mindful of beginning time and end time for those who maybe do have bedtime for kids, or they get up early for work or school or whatever. So there are all sorts of logistics to talk about. Those are things you can talk with me about, and you'll have to figure out with your group. But in the meantime, your homework for this time is to take a gathering planner, which is a document kind of like the care planner that I give group leaders and send them every single week to help them ask the important questions about their gathering. Why are we gathering together? What are we talking about that night? Is there anything that we need to let them know about beforehand? Are there announcements we need to share about stuff going on in the church? What is this text or whatever? What is it calling me to believe? How is it calling me to live? How is it calling us to be empowered by God and the Spirit through the gospel to be faithful? So it asks those questions and then encourages you to figure out what it looks like to send people out at the end of the two. So it hits on a lot of these things. I want you to do a gathering planner for 3 different gatherings. And that might all be built around a focal passage or like being under the Word together. Or it might be other things. But I want you to take 3 gatherings, 3 planners, and just fill them all out for what a gathering might look like for you, hypothetically, your future group. So do that. Hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully this has been helpful. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next time.